Welcome to Cinema Bites.
Water! No. Curse you, B-Run!
Your go-to for movie recaps in a flash. Big twists, epic moments, all in just minutes. The movie, The BFG, begins in an orphanage in London. The nanny was closing the door of the orphanage but saw a magazine thrown on the floor next to a letter. She got busy with the magazine and forgot to close the door. Then a little girl appeared from under the blanket. Her name was Sophie, and she was 10 years old. Sophie saw that the nanny hadn't closed the door, so she goes to the door, locks it, moves the clock's hand, and sets it to 3 a.m. Sophie retrieves the note left by the nanny, turns off the house lights, and convinces herself that 3 a.m. is the hour of magic, unlike most people who believe it's midnight. This is why Sophie always wakes up at 3 a.m. Sophie goes to the nanny's library, places the note in her drawer, and then hears noises coming from outside. She opens the window to find the source of the sounds and discovers that the noises are from a group of drunken people. Sophie yells at them to be quiet because children are sleeping and threatens to call the police if they don't leave. The noisy people are frightened by Sophie's threat and leave the area. As Sophie steps away from the window, a strange shadow appears behind her, but she doesn't notice it. Sophie returns to her bed, covers herself with her blanket, puts on her glasses, turns on her flashlight, and continues reading her book. Seconds later, Sophie hears the nanny approaching the room, so she turns off the flashlight and hides completely under the blanket to avoid being seen. The nanny doesn't notice her and leaves. Once she's gone, Sophie resumes her reading. Sophie hears noises again from outside, but remembers the nanny's strict instructions not to leave the bed or open the curtains at night. However, Sophie doesn't follow the rules. She discovers that the street gang is causing the noises, running after each other and knocking over trash bins. Suddenly, a giant hand appears and fixes the trash. The owner of the giant hand emerges from behind a wall and notices Sophie watching him. Sophie runs back to her bed, hides under the blanket, hoping the giant won't see her. Unfortunately, the giant does see her, extends his hand through the window and takes her along with her book and blanket. The giant runs through the streets of London, using various tricks to avoid being seen by humans. Sometimes he pretends to be a wall, a street lamp, or a load on the back of a car. Eventually, the giant leaves the city and heads to the countryside, jumping among strange clouds until he arrives in the land of giants. There, he enters the cave where he lives. The giant hangs Sophie on a tree branch and begins cutting strange vegetables with his knife. Sophie uses the opportunity while the giant is distracted to escape from the blanket and heads toward the window. Unfortunately, the window is too heavy for her to open. Sophie accidentally knocks over a basket from a shelf but manages to catch it before it hits the ground, so the giant doesn't notice. Sophie carries the basket and moves in the opposite direction, but this time, she causes some items to fall to the ground. The noise catches the giant's attention, and he notices her. The giant tells her she can't escape unless she has wings. He pushes the window toward her, causing her to fall into the pan he's holding. The giant continues cutting the vegetables while Sophie asks him where they are. The giant tells her they're in the land of giants. Sophie doesn't believe him and insists there's no such place. She hears loud noises coming from outside the giant's house, which turn out to be other giants. At this moment, Sophie becomes terrified and begs the giant not to eat her. The giant laughs at her fear and assures her he doesn't eat humans. Sophie accuses the giant of kidnapping her against her will, and he doesn't deny it. He tells her her family must be worried about her, but Sophie reveals that she's an orphan raised in an orphanage and didn't like the place because the nanny was strict with them. The giant sympathizes with Sophie and returns her belongings. Sophie asks if the other giants are as kind as he is, but the giant suddenly becomes serious and tells her the other giants eat humans. The giant's words frighten Sophie, and she asks why he kidnapped her. The giant responds with confusing words, implying that when she saw him in London, she might have told other humans about him, leading to his capture and imprisonment in a zoo. Sophie promises not to tell anyone if he lets her go, but the giant doesn't believe her and says she must stay with him for the rest of her life. Sophie declares she'll escape, but the giant throws the blanket over her to silence her and takes her to a bed he prepared for her in a ship. He warns her that if she leaves his house, the evil giants will eat her. Sophie becomes angry and accuses the giant of being unable to speak properly because his words are confusing. The giant feels hurt by her mockery, so she apologizes. Sophie notices the giant holding a jar containing something glowing and asks about it. The giant explains that the jar contains dreams. Sophie tells the giant she hasn't dreamed in a while and has trouble sleeping. The giant takes her book and magnifying glass and begins reading to her. Sophie is surprised the giant can read, but she eventually falls asleep while he's reading. After Sophie falls asleep, the giant goes to the dream room. Sophie wakes up to the sound of the giant snoring and uses the opportunity to escape through the window. However, as soon as she leaves the house, Another giant catches her and tries to eat her. Sophie sees the kind giant standing in his house and calls out for his help, but he ignores her cries and shuts the door. The evil giant throws her into his mouth, and at that moment, Sophie wakes up and realizes it was all a dream. She discovers that the kind giant made her dream of this nightmare to remind her that the other giants eat humans and that she must always hide from them. While they talk, Sophie notices a strange fizzy drink with the giant. The drink's bubbles move downward instead of upward. Sophie tells him this will cause gas in his stomach, but the giant says that's the best part and starts drinking it. Moments later, he releases explosive gases, causing Sophie to laugh. Suddenly, an evil giant named the Greedy Giant bursts into the kind giant's house and questions him about who he was talking to. Sophie hides behind the fizzy drink bottle. The Greedy Giant complains about a thorn in his hand and asks the kind giant to remove it. While removing the thorn, the Greedy Giant smells Sophie and asks the kind giant if he has a pet. The kind giant tries to change the subject, and Sophie hides inside a vegetable the giant is eating. The Greedy Giant sniffs around but gets distracted when the kind giant offers him the vegetables on the table. Unfortunately, Sophie is inside one of the vegetables. To protect her, the kind giant clings to the Greedy Giant's arm and tricks him into thinking he enjoys eating humans with vegetables. The Greedy Giant is deceived. The gentle giant was deceived by the words of the frightened giant, who threw the vegetables on the ground and was about to step on them. But the gentle giant managed to distract him at the last moment and pushed him out of the house. The gentle giant picked up the vegetables from the ground and placed them on the table. At that moment, Sophie emerged, and the giant extended his hand to her. Sophie climbed onto his hand, and he took her to a secret place in his house where he hid dreams. The giant let Sophie wash up and clean her clothes from the vegetables, and he gave her some clothes to choose from. Sophie chose a beautiful red jacket, and the giant helped her wash and change. When the giant asked her where she got the jacket, Sophie replied that she got it from the clothes he had given her. The giant felt sad, and when Sophie asked him why he was upset, he said it was nothing. The giant carried Sophie on his shoulder and took her to the dream room. Sophie asked the giant about his job, but he told her it was a big secret. Sophie insisted on knowing everything because she was going to spend the rest of her life in the land of giants. The giant told Sophie that he hunted dreams and put them in jars, hanging them on a tree. Sophie then asked him to take her with him when he hunted dreams. The giant warned her that if the other giants saw her, they would eat her. But Sophie argued that if she stayed alone, the giants would eat her anyway. After much pleading, the giant agreed to take her with him. As soon as they left the house, they found many giants sleeping on the ground. The gentle giant tried to pass through them without being noticed, but the frightened giant woke up and grabbed him by the leg. When the gentle giant fell to the ground, Sophie ran and hid in a car. The giants started tossing the gentle giant around like a ball for fun. When they got bored of that game, they started a new one. One giant took 2 cars and used them as skates, one of which was the car Sophie was hiding in. Another giant got on a large truck and tried to make the cars crash into each other. But Sophie managed to steer the car she was in and avoided the collision at the last moment. The giants seemed to be enjoying the game, but suddenly it started raining. All the giants ran for cover because they were afraid of water. As soon as Sophie and the gentle giant left the area, the giants found Sophie's blanket, smelled it, and realized there was a human in the land of giants. Meanwhile, the giant took Sophie and jumped into a strange lake, crossing it to the place where he hunted dreams. He told her that he could hear everything, even whispers, because of his giant ears. Sophie helped the giant catch dreams, and he allowed her to place the dream she caught into a jar. The dream took the shape of her face on the jar's wall. The giant encouraged Sophie to catch more dreams, and she ran after them enthusiastically. She caught a red-colored dream and brought it back to the giant. The giant quickly took the red dream from her and told her it was a nightmare. After that, the giant disappeared, leaving Sophie terrified and calling out for him. The giant emerged from the lake, extended his hand, and took Sophie with him. Sophie then gave him a name, BFG, Big Friendly Giant. BFG and Sophie went to the Netherlands, where BFG began distributing dreams to sleeping people. BFG asked Sophie about the type of dreams she wanted to distribute to humans, and Sophie told him to spread happy dreams. BFG distributed the dreams while talking to Sophie, telling her that giants had existed on Earth since ancient times and had no parents. They both went to a child's room, and BFG told her that the child dreamt of shaking hands with the President of the United States. Sophie was delighted by the child's beautiful dream. BFG and Sophie left London and saw the other giants on their way out. It was clear they were still eating children. Sophie told BFG that she had forgotten her blanket in the land of giants, which worried him greatly. In the next scene, Sophie woke up in front of her orphanage and realized she was in a dream. She called out to BFG, but he didn't respond. BFG appeared later and told Sophie that she had left her blanket in the land of giants, and now the giants knew about her existence. making her life very dangerous. Sophie told him she wanted to stay with him, and BFG told her the story of the boy who once wore the red jacket. BFG explained that the boy had seen him distributing dreams, just as Sophie had, so he had to take the boy to the land of giants. Unfortunately, the other giants found the boy and ate him. Since then, BFG had blamed himself for the boy's death. Sophie told BFG she wasn't afraid and wanted to stay with him, but BFG didn't listen and left her. Sophie returned to her room and began whispering to BFG, knowing he would hear her because of his giant ears. Sophie stood on the balcony and said she could feel BFG's presence. She jumped, and BFG caught her before she hit the ground, saving her from death. After this suicidal act, BFG had no choice but to take her back to the land of giants. Unfortunately, the frightened giant saw them entering the house together. Sophie said they needed a plan and entered the dream room with BFG to think. Suddenly, the frightened giant burst into BFG's house, using a large umbrella to protect himself from the rain. Other giants entered with him, and Sophie hid. The frightened giant revealed Sophie's blanket and made the other giants smell it. They all began searching for Sophie, destroying the dream room. BFG tried to stop the giants from destroying the place and hurting Sophie, telling them that giants had always been kind. But the frightened giant retorted, saying that was in the past. They now ate children. Sophie ran around the room, trying to hide from the giants, and entered a small room inside a tree. This room had belonged to the previous child who lived with BFG. The frightened giant approached the small room where Sophie was hiding, but BFG mustered his courage, grabbed a hot iron rod, and burned the frightened giant with it. The frightened giant took the iron rod from BFG and was about to hit him with it, but BFG grabbed a bucket of water, scaring all the giants and driving them out of his house. BFG insulted the frightened giant, calling him a disgrace to giants. Sophie saw a picture of the Queen of England in the previous child's room. The past and the picture gave the idea of a great plan to eliminate the giants. BFG was talking to himself, saying that his words were confusing and his personality was weak, but Sophie encouraged him and told him that his words were correct and his personality was strong. At that moment, BFG was happy because of her words. Sophie told BFG that she had a plan and said they would seek the help of the Queen of England to get rid of the giants. Indeed, BFG began preparing a dream mixture to convince the Queen of their plan. After BFG finished the Queen's dream, he placed it in a jar and labeled it "For the Queen." Sophie began finalizing her plan. Sophie told BFG that she would introduce him to the Queen as her servant, but BFG's pride didn't allow it, and he told her he wouldn't be anyone's servant. Afterward, the two headed to the Queen's palace, evaded the guards, and managed to reach her room. BFG opened the window and released the special dream for the Queen, and indeed, the dream entered the Queen's mind. The next morning, the Queen woke up startled because of the dream, as she had dreamed of the giants and Sophie with BFG. The Queen's maid, Mary, entered and asked why she was startled. The Queen then told her she had a nightmare. Moments later, Mr. Tibbs entered with the Queen's breakfast, and the Queen began narrating the nightmare. She said she saw wild giants kidnapping children and also heard a strange voice telling her the names of those giants. Of course, that voice was Sophie's. Mary began reading the newspaper and told the Queen that there were indeed cases of child abductions. Despite all this, the Queen wasn't convinced that giants were kidnapping children. She then ordered Mary to open the curtains. Mary screamed in fear as soon as she opened the curtains because she saw Sophie. At that moment, the Queen said Sophie was standing at the window in her dream, just as she was standing now. Sophie told them about BFG and said he was her best friend and hiding in the garden. As soon as Mr. Tibbs heard Sophie's words, he alerted the guards to keep their eyes open. The Queen told Sophie she dreamed of her, and the BFG asking for her help. Sophie then asked the Queen to promise not to harm BFG, and the Queen indeed promised. Sophie asked BFG to reveal himself, and as soon as he did, the guards surrounded him and pointed their weapons at him. Sophie asked the Queen to have her guards lower their weapons, especially since she had promised her. The Queen ordered Mr. Tibbs to have the guards step back. The guards moved away from BFG, who approached the Queen. BFG told the Queen he was Sophie's friend and had come to help them get rid of the evil giants. The Queen contacted the army, and at the same time, Mary took Sophie to clean her up. They all entered the dining hall. The servants prepared a table and a special chair for BFG, using a ladder to serve him food. They also gave him a large gardening fork to eat with. As soon as BFG tasted the food, he said it was the most delicious food he had ever tasted. But when they gave him coffee, he didn't like its taste. BFG brought out his special fizzy drink. At the same moment, Mr. Tibbs informed the Queen that the army leaders had arrived. The Queen told the leaders they had one chance to enter the giant city and that they needed to eliminate the evil giants to protect their children. They presented BFG with a map and asked him to pinpoint the location of the giant city. BFG told them the giant city wasn't on Earth and that its entrance was through the clouds. He offered them his special fizzy drink, and they all drank it to celebrate. The Queen issued the order to move toward the giant city. They left London accompanied by helicopters. As soon as they entered the clouds, the helicopters' radars malfunctioned. The helicopters stopped at the border of the giant city, and BFG and Sophie entered his house to prepare special nightmares for the giants. BFG told Sophie that if the nightmares affected the giants, they could easily defeat them. Sophie saw the jar containing her dream and asked about it. At that moment, BFG told her that her life would be beautiful and free of pressures. BFG told Sophie she would return to London after they defeated the giants. Sophie was sad because she would leave him and asked if he would be able to hear her. BFG assured her he would hear her thanks to his big ears. They promised each other with their pinkies not to forget one another. They then went to unleash the nightmares on the giants. Unfortunately, BFG forgot the tool to release the dreams, so Sophie took the jar and sneaked among the giants, breaking it. Indeed, the nightmares entered the minds of all the giants, terrifying them. Unfortunately, the gluttonous giant woke up before Sophie broke the jar and prevented the nightmare from entering his mind. He attacked Sophie, but BFG intervened and hit him with his shoulder. The gluttonous giant grabbed BFG like a toy in his hand and was about to punch him in the face. But the army's helicopters arrived just in time and saved him. The helicopters tied up the giants with ropes. Sophie was running among the giants to avoid being killed. At the last moment, BFG picked her up before the gluttonous giant could kill her. The helicopters transported the giants to an isolated island, throwing them into the water and feeding them seeds and grains. That was the only food available on the island, so they had to get used to it and forget the taste of humans. After this adventure, Mary adopted Sophie, and she lived with her in the palace. One day, Sophie woke up and said she dreamed of BFG. Sophie said she saw BFG in his beautiful garden, cooking delicious food over a fire. She leaned out the window and began talking to him. Of course, he could hear her because of his big ears. In the final scene of the movie, Sophie says good morning to BFG, and BFG hears her and smiles. This brings us to the end of our movie. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.